go. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming out to join us. As you know, we're talking about independent politics and the rise of the independent voter and the changes that are happening in American politics because of nonpartisan and independent voters and reforms across the country. Today's guest is really at the forefront of some really interesting reforms happening in the electoral space in Maine that I think you're really going to enjoy. So I'd like to introduce Kyle Bailey to you. Kyle Bailey has over a decade of experience in management and fundraising for candidate campaigns, ballot measure campaigns, and advocacy organizations. In 2016, Kyle led the first in the nation successful statewide ballot measure campaign to adopt ranked choice voting by the second largest vote of the people in Maine's history. In 2012, Kyle managed in-state fundraising for another first in the nation ballot measure victory that secured the freedom to marry for same-sex couples in Maine. Kyle also worked on the Maine gubernatorial campaign of Elliott Cutler in 2014, the Atlanta, Georgia mayoral campaign of Mary Norwood in 2009, and the Georgia lieutenant governor campaign of Jim Martin in 2006. In 2018, Kyle is leading a people's veto campaign to the June 2018 ballot to restore ranked choice voting in Maine after it was repealed by Maine Legislature last year. He is also managing the Clean Elections gubernatorial bid of Maine's first independent state treasurer, Terry Hayes. Kyle is the owner and president of Peachtree Strategies. He was born in Florida, raised in Georgia, lives in Gorham, Maine, and his husband is State Representative Andrew McLean. Thank you for coming.
My pleasure.
So I mentioned ranked choice voting several times in that introduction, and something major happened in ranked choice voting this week, but we're not going to mention it yet because we first need to explain just what is ranked choice voting. Can you give us the primer on this?
Sure. Well, thanks so much for having me here today, and thank you all for being here. So ranked choice voting is simply a different way of electing politicians. So we're accustomed to walking into a voting booth and, you know, if there's two choices, we pick one, and on election night, all the votes get tallied up and somebody gets a majority and somebody doesn't, and there's a winner. And whether you voted for that person or not who won, you at least know a majority of your friends and neighbors voted for that person. What happens increasingly in races across the country, and has been going on for a long time in Maine, is we fairly commonly have 3-, 4-, 5-way races for governor, for Congress, for United States Senate, for state legislature. And in fact, in 9 of the last 11 elections for governor in Maine, the candidate who won received less than 50% of the vote in 5 of those races. Almost half of our governor's elections since the 1970s, the candidate who won received less than 40% of the vote, so more than 60% of voters were voting for someone else. And in those races where you have more than 2 candidates, you have vote splitting comes up as a topic of conversation. Suddenly one or more candidates are a spoiler. They need to get out of the race. The ideas that they are trying to bring forward in their campaign aren't heard. Campaigns become increasingly negative because now you're no longer accountable perhaps as a candidate to talk about the issues. You can just beat the heck out of somebody else and tell their supporters, well, if you don't vote for me, you're wasting your vote, and that means so-and-so gets to win. So vote your fears, not your hopes. And so campaigns become increasingly about that sort of dialogue. And that's been happening in Maine for a long time. Starting in the 1990s, Angus King, who some of you may know is the United States Senator from Maine, was elected governor of Maine in 1994 with 35% of the vote. It's the lowest vote getter that we've had in Maine. And in response to that election, a conversation emerged about, are there other alternative ways of selecting politicians? And what are those? And so I won't drone on about the history, but the long story short is folks started looking into it. The legislature started to look at it. League of Women Voters started to look at it. And that culminated in our state a citizen initiative to advance ranked choice voting. And so what it does is eliminates the spoiler effect and the vote splitting. All that goes away with ranked choice voting. It works just like an actual runoff election, which some of you may be familiar with, without the cost and delay and getting folks to come out back to the polls and vote again, and millions of dollars from away being spent on elections. So it's a built-in runoff, automatic runoff system, sometimes called instant runoff voting. I think the easiest way to explain it is probably just to show an example of how ranked choice voting works. So I'm not sure where Eric went. Do we lose Eric? Eric's coming up. So while Eric's going to come up, we're just going to show a little demonstration, a hypothetical situation that might happen in a campaign. It may be something that you will recognize and have seen in campaigns before. So I'll start out with Jim here. So you're just hold that up there. You're an established individual. You're very mainstream. People like you. They know you. We're having an election. Overwhelmingly, people say, I really like this guy. Now, there's this young upstart that comes along. He has all the answers to all the problems in the world, and is a fairly charismatic individual, and so is drawing a basic level of support. So these two folks are running against each other. 60% of voters think he would be the best candidate for the job. 40% of voters think that Eric would be the best candidate for the job. That's a two-way race, right? Now, suddenly something happens. I, Kyle Bailey from Maine, a carpetbagger, decide I'm going to jump in this Kansas race, and all of a sudden, 25% of voters say, I really like that Kyle Bailey. He's got some really interesting ideas. He wants to do this ranked choice voting thing. I think that's really cool. People in Douglas County are like, oh, I like that Kyle Bailey. So suddenly, what happens is, Jim, flip yours around, 35% of voters, I'm drawing support from people who like Jim the best. So people who have liked him are starting to like my message, and some of those people are moving over to me. Suddenly we have an election where Jim has 35% of the vote, I have 25% of the vote, and this young upstart over here with all the answers knows exactly what to do has 40% of the vote. So in a first past the post election with three candidates, the person with the most votes wins. That would be, in this situation, Eric. But what if with a ranked choice voting system, we actually have a built-in process of elimination to see, well, hold on a second, Eric may have the most votes, but he doesn't have the majority. He doesn't have 50% plus one. So what would happen if this race got narrowed down to two candidates, right? Where would voters go? What are the true preferences of voters? So in this election, with ranked choice voting, voters get a ballot where they get to say, this candidate's my first choice, this candidate's my second choice, and this candidate's my third choice. So in this election, 35% of voters think Jim is the best candidate, 25% of voters think I'm the best candidate, 40% think Eric's the best candidate. Nobody has a majority, so we look to see who's in last place. That's me. I'm eliminated. So I'm out of the running, and we're back down to two candidates, Eric and Jim. So what happens is, all the people who liked me, who make me their first choice, say, well, if I can't have Kyle, I really like Jim. I think he'd do a decent job. He's my second choice. So everybody voted for me. Their ballots get picked up and moved to the pile for Jim. And suddenly we actually find that Jim is actually the preferred candidate among voters. So ranked choice voting is a built-in runoff system that captures voters' true preferences. So there you go.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you.
Thanks for running. Is this in operation somewhere? Is somebody using this, and does it work? And what are the outcomes?
Yeah. So ranked choice voting is used in about a dozen U.S. cities right now, including Minneapolis, St. Paul, cities in the Bay Area and California, Portland, Maine have used it. Maine voters approved it in 2016. We'll start using it in June. North Carolina has used it in a statewide election once. And what's really interesting is places across the world have been using ranked choice voting for a long time. So Australia has used ranked choice voting since 1917 to elect its parliament. Ireland uses it to elect its president. London uses it to elect its mayor. So in parliamentary systems where you naturally have more than two choices, you've seen ranked choice voting become a more viable alternative than places in the United States where you are starting to see more races with three or more candidates, and thus the conversation about ranked choice voting is emerging.
And it happens all the time without it being seen as a strange thing. I mean, we do this in parties do it every time when they elect their leadership, right? I mean,
they do, yeah. And a lot of places in the Maine Legislature, there's balloting. If nobody gets a majority, the last candidate drops off. There's a retabulation of ballots. We rank choices every day of our lives, and this is what it really gets down to simple. If you're at home talking with your family, and somebody wants to go to Ruby Tuesdays, and somebody wants to go to Applebee's, and the kids want to go to somewhere else, you sit and you have a family conversation and find, consensus, or maybe you're the parent that says, no, we're going here. But either way, we generally tend to operate in thinking about having more than two choices. It's only in politics, really, that we settle in a pretty significant way for two choices. And when there are more than two choices, suddenly these dynamics kick in where the system limits how many choices that we think we actually have. And so those dynamics kick in, and that's what ranked choice voting is designed to do, is to eliminate those negatives that happen when you have more than two choices. So it allows voters to have more voice in an election to express their preferences, and more choice because there's no spoiler effect. And you never have to vote for a lesser of two evils when there's another candidate you really like with a ranked choice voting system.
Well, let's unpack that spoiler thing a little bit. Just put that into real world terms. If there's multiple candidates, what are the dynamics that happen when you have those multi-candidates going at each other?
Well, when you have the two-person race, it's the back and forth about issues and whatnot. As soon as that third person or fourth or fifth person enters a race, suddenly somebody can win with less than a majority. And they may look around and say, my best path to victory is to tailor my message and my focus to a particular group of voters, to the 30% of voters who hold this particular ideological view or whatnot, and cater to those voters, and ultimately possibly win the election with a third of voters backing them, and feeling as though they are accountable to that faction of voters rather than to voters more broadly. And that's a real problem with the first past the post system that we've been using all across the country for a long time in these races where you have multiple candidates. Is suddenly somebody gets into a race and they're running because they have ideas and they have a voice and a perspective that needs to be heard, and they're boxed out of the conversation because one of the two big parties, is usually what it comes down to, says, no, you are a spoiler. You're going to cost us the election. You need to get out. Their ideas never even get heard.
Yeah, you have no way of winning. So,
right. Don't waste your vote on this candidate. And so suddenly the conversation and the media starts talking about spoilers and wasted votes, and that becomes all consuming. And we find, I can talk about Maine's experience more than anywhere else because that's where I've lived, is in these races where we have multiple candidates, which are so common under the old system. We literally, almost every story is talking about polling. What do the polls say? And people are sitting at the coffee shop saying, well, who do you like? Well, aren't they a spoiler? Don't want to waste your vote. Or, hey, what do the polls say right now? Who's in second place? Who's in third place? I don't want to waste my vote. And so, for me, what brought me to work on this issue was working in these races where these effects come into play. And, for me, I feel like there's about 2 weeks every 2 years where we can sit around the coffee shop or the dining room table and have a conversation about some of these issues. Who do you like? Who's your favorite candidate? What do you think about their health care policy? And suddenly in a place where you have multiple candidates, those conversations get replaced by, what do the polls say? Who's the spoiler? I don't want to waste my vote. And so ranked choice voting is designed to remove all those strategic considerations and allow you as a voter to walk into the voting booth and say, I'm going to vote my hopes and not my fears. I'm going to rank my choices and really vote for my first choice, knowing that if my first choice can't win, if they're eliminated in a round of ballot counting because they're at the bottom of the pile, they've got the fewest votes, that's fine. I have a second choice, and I can express that. But you never feel like your vote is wasted, right? Because if your first candidate can't win, your vote automatically counts for your second choice. In a process of elimination that narrows down the field of candidates and elects a winner more broadly, who isn't just accountable to a narrow faction, but is accountable to voters more broadly in a coalition they built by attracting first, second, and sometimes third choice rankings.
So have you seen it, or do you expect that the way people campaign, will people stop stripping the bark off of each other with these negative ads and these real ripper campaigns because you'd be afraid of maybe alienating people who would be voting for you as your second choice?
Yes, and so what was really interesting running the campaign in Maine was even our opponents doing their homework acknowledged that one of the benefits of ranked choice voting is more civility in campaigns. So when you've got 3 or 4 or 5 candidates running under the system, the old system, the way we've been doing it, the incentive is to energize your base and turn them out to vote and beat the heck out of your opponents. But with ranked choice voting, suddenly the calculus changes. You can't just win with 30% or 35% of the vote. You got to get to 50% plus one. And to do that, you need to attract supporters who like another candidate better. And if you go out and trash and burn that candidate, their supporters aren't going to make you their second choice. They'll go looking for somebody else. And so instead of engaging in mudslinging, you need to contrast yourself with that candidate, but also find common ground, because you want those supporters to make you their second choice. And so ranked choice voting makes parties, PACs, and politicians think twice about engaging in negative campaigning, because you as a voter have the power to punish candidates who cross the line by either ranking them as your last choice or withholding or ranking from them at all.
Now what about the confusion factor? Are you seeing where people are so used to this, I have this binary choice, I'm either going to vote A or B. Now you're going to make me think about 4 candidates or 5 candidates, or do I have to think about 5 candidates?
Well, in Maine, we advocated for ranked choice voting because we were having multiple candidate races, so it was already a reality. And I think you're seeing that reality happen more and more all across the country. I mean, we just had a presidential race. There were 4 candidates. There were a lot of conversations about vote splitting spoilers and don't vote for the Green or the Libertarian. You're wasting your vote. All those sort of things. We're going to see that more and more in our politics, because I think people are frustrated with the partisanship and the gridlock, and they're going to be looking for more alternatives, and more people are going to decide to run outside of the two-party system. And so I think we could do a better job being prepared to handle that by looking at systems like ranked choice voting as a better way to elect candidates in systems where voters really feel like their voices are being heard more clearly.
And so what do you think it's going to do for participation? Do you think it will it increase because people now, I can see it long term, but in the first times you do this, is it confusing in any way? Is it going to reduce people's turnout?
Well, the first time ranked choice voting is used in a lot of places, we see an uptick in voter participation. So in Portland, Maine, Portland voters adopted ranked choice voting via a referendum in 2010. It was used in 2011 in the Portland, Maine mayoral election. They had to go print ballots a couple times during the middle of the day because turnout was 40% higher than they projected it to be. Now that's an outlier, but Minneapolis, St. Paul just had an election where they had record turnout in their elections and had a very diverse slate of people elected to city council that voters really felt like were, for the first time, really represented a fairly diverse multicultural city, and ranked choice voting helped to make that possible.
So where are the political parties on this?
So, I don't know that either of the national parties have a stance on ranked choice voting. I can only speak to Maine. We ran a very nonpartisan campaign to win ranked choice voting in November of 2016. It was a 2-year campaign, so I've been working on this for a while. And we did because it's a nonpartisan issue. I mean, when we look back at Maine's experience, I talked about those 9 of 11 elections for governor, which nobody got a majority. Our last 6 governors, 2 were Republicans, 2 were Democrats, 2 were independents. All of them won at least one of their races with less than a majority. And so I could point back and say, this is, there's going to be years where a Republican benefits from this, years where a Democrat benefits this, years where an independent third-party candidate benefits from it. Why? Because it's designed to give people what they want. Because it captures the true preferences of voters and figures out where are the majority of you landing in this election by being able to focus on where is their commonality, where are voters aligned, rather than dividing the electorate and winning with a small faction. And so, I think that's really key.
Will this cause an increase in third parties, in additional parties, or just more independents?
It's a good question. We'll see if there's an uptick in Maine in the future around candidates running because of this. We've got candidates running for Congress and other races as outside of the 2 parties, but that's not uncommon for our state. So I will say that we're having a ranked choice voting election. Our first statewide ranked choice voting election will be on June 12th, 2018, and that's the Democratic and Republican primaries. There are 4 Republicans running in the primary for governor. There are 7 Democrats running the Democratic primary. And ranked choice voting will be used. And so there'll be the process of finding out what are voters' true preferences and where does the majority land in both those primaries. And I think that will, going back to your previous question, really help to educate some of the folks in the parties who have concern. I can say that when we started this, we really worked at the grassroots to reach out to people all across the state. We were smart and strategic and said, let's not go have meetings with people who we think are going to figure out what we're up to and raise some red flags. Let's not go talk to the state chair of the party. Let's go talk to the town chairs and have one-on-one conversations. And so we kind of worked around the power structures that were to engage people at a more grassroots level. So we talked a lot to voters, and then we talked a lot to local community leaders. And we were able to build significant support. The Green Party, the Libertarian Party, and the Democratic Party ended up endorsing ranked choice voting in that campaign. On the Democratic side, it wasn't because it was top down, it was because we had worked the bottom up. And we had a pretty good chunk of support within the Republican rank and file as well, less at the top of the parties. But, you know, we found a way to organize around those who opposed ranked choice voting and use partisan messengers to reach other partisans. And so that was key for us is, you know, I work in the independent space, so showing up to convince a Republican or Democrat that this is the right thing to do didn't make me the best messenger, right? But I could send Peter Mills, who ran for governor twice as a Republican, to go talk to Republicans. And I could send Shelley Pinger, who's the Democratic congresswoman from the 1st district, to go talk to Democrats, right? We had people we could tap on both sides to do that. And, you know, I think what we did is we just ran a really smart stealth campaign. We were under the radar for most of the campaign. You know, it's so funny when I look back at the story of Maine and how we got ranked choice voting, and it's a long story with a lot of ups and downs. When we started collecting signatures for ranked choice voting, we started on election day, right before election day, but election day 2014. We got 38,000 signatures on election day. We had 10 days to organize. We got 200 volunteers together. We collected signatures at the polls. When we took out the petitions and started collecting signatures, I think a lot of the political elite and the operatives and the establishment said, well, isn't that cute? You know, they're never going to get the signatures to put this on the ballot, but that's cute. And so when we turned the signatures in, they thought, oh, well, that's cute. Maine people are never going to, you know, embrace ranked choice voting. I mean, come on,
Crazy,
right? It's
yeah.
crazy San Francisco liberal idea. No one's ever going to go for that. And then we went out and had 150,000 one-on-one conversations with voters. And we built a coalition of Republicans and Democrats and independents and Greens and Libertarians who supported ranked choice voting. And we started to get organizational endorsements. And then election day showed up, and we got 52% of the vote, the second highest vote getting an issue that year, behind only raising the minimum wage in our state. And I think that sent shockwaves through some of the political establishment. But even at that point, they weren't too worried, because they thought, oh, well, that was a fluke.
Yeah.
But we'll just repeal it. You know, we control the legislature. We'll just get rid of it. So, in the legislature, the session immediately following the election, opponents introduced a repeal bill. Well, then we generated thousands and thousands of phone calls and lobby visits to the State House, and all of a sudden their repeal bill died. Didn't have the votes to pass. So then they started to get a little more worried. And they started playing around with some language, and they called a special session on October 23rd of 2017 to deal with another referendum that they were trying to repeal, that the voters had disapproved. And at a late night, they managed to figure out how to get 3 votes in the State House to repeal ranked choice voting. So the legislature repealed the ranked choice voting law that voters had approved at the ballot box 1 year earlier. And that launched our people's veto. And so what's interesting about that, once again, October 23rd, they put us in a position to go out and collect signatures again to put it back on the ballot, to repeal the legislature's repeal.
Yeah,
that's what people's veto
which
does.
Which is not, most states don't have.
Which most states do not have. So this is an interesting part of our Constitution we amended 100 years ago. I think, and I want to believe that the voters did that 100 years because they knew this exact same situation would come up at some point where the people initiated something and the legislature repealed it, and we needed to have some sort of mechanism to be able to turn around and say, no, thank you. And so we have the people's veto. And so, but they positioned it in such a way, they scheduled this session on October 23rd, and the way the timeline works, knowing that we wouldn't be able to start collecting signatures until November, and we only had 90 days to collect 61,123 signatures. And I think they thought, well, there's no way they're going to do that in the dead of winter in Maine, you know. And sure enough, in 88 days, we got over 80,000 signatures and put it back on the ballot. And then at that point, of course, then they introduced legislation again to try to stop this, to try to stop implementation. We filed a lawsuit to require the Secretary of State to implement it because it was the law, the people's veto. By forcing the people's veto, by trying to overturn the legislature's repeal, we actually froze the law in place as voters had approved it, meaning that ranked choice voting is a law of the state of Maine until voters get the chance to weigh in and get it in June. But that means it's the law of the land governing the June 12, 2018 primary elections. So about half of the Senate, so a quarter of the legislature, decided to file a lawsuit saying the Secretary of State doesn't have the authority to spend money to implement a ranked choice voting election because we didn't explicitly give him authority to implement an election in which ranked choice ballots are used. By the way, it's a line item that says elections, and there's a lump sum of money there. And the budget was approved after ranked choice voting was already approved by voters. So anyways, we go through this long lawsuit, and I think they thought they'd be able to stop us, to stop the Secretary of State from implementing ranked choice voting. And so they thought if they ever have to do it, then they'll never have to do it. Right? If they can get away with it this time, they'll always be able to get away with it. And sure enough, yesterday, the Maine Supreme Court said, no, you must implement ranked choice voting for the June 12, 2018 election. So Maine will be the first state where voters have a chance to rank their choices in the June ballot.
That's incredible. Congratulations.
Thank
That's
you.
a huge victory. Now, but I'm sure it's short-lived, right? They were going to come back again and come after it.
Look, I think our opponents are pretty relentless at this point. And it's fascinating to me because when you hear them talk on television and in print media, they say, ranked choice voting is not going to make campaigns more civil. It's just, this is a solution in search of a problem. It's not necessary. It's a waste of money. And, it's just not needed. And so that doesn't quite explain the intensity of their opposition to it.
Yeah.
And so what I genuinely believe is that privately they say, boy, this is going to turn things upside down. This is the people being able to put something on the ballot that shifts political power back to them and away from politicians. We can't let them get away with this. We can't let the people do that because who knows where they're going to stop, right? The people start claiming more power for themselves. At what point are they going to stop? Are they going to try to, have nonpartisan redistricting and take that away from us? I mean, what's next, right? And I think that's what their genuine concern is. It's about protecting, their fiefdoms, their power, and it's on both sides of the aisle. We see it in the legislature because there are some pretty powerful people that have benefited from the status quo. And, change is never easy, especially for those in that situation. And that's where our opposition comes from. And, they'll continue to keep trying to undermine it. But I think winning in the Supreme Court is pretty significant. And, we're going to have a new governor when the legislature convenes again next year. We'll have a new legislative composition. And ranked choice voting will be an issue in some of these campaigns where a lot of people are really upset that for the first time in 100 years since Maine people approved the citizen initiative process, the legislature has stepped in and repealed a law that voters initiated and approved at the ballot box. And they didn't just do that with ranked choice voting. There were 4 issues that voters approved on the November 2016 ballot in Maine. All of them were repealed or fundamentally changed by the Maine legislature. So there's a lot of voters who are ticked off. And they want to send a clear message, whether ranked choice voting is their issue or not. This is the only people's veto on the ballot in June. And it's been a pretty profound conversation and a pretty vocal conversation at debates and other places where voters are really, I think, looking to hold accountable the politicians and find out, how did you vote on this? Did you repeal this? And so that's going to be a really important conversation in our elections this year.
Well, I think it could have incredibly profound effects on politics in Maine, and I think that it could be a catalyst for bigger changes in a lot of different places. We've talked a lot in these discussion groups about what are elections, what are they for, and for whose benefit are they held. And all too often we fall into this place where we think that elections happen for the benefit of Republicans and Democrats to fight it out amongst themselves, and one of those two we're going to win that election. But this changes it. This flips it on the head that says, no, the parties aren't in charge of elections. Elections are not held for the benefit of the parties. They're held for the benefit of the voter.
Right.
And this really elevates the power of the individual voter of what you're doing. So I think that, talk about that a little bit, because that philosophically, fundamentally changes what elections are about.
Well, I think you're right, and I think that is what has drawn so many people to be a part of our effort in Maine. You know, when we started this movement, we started it thinking this is just the right thing to do. We'll file a citizen initiative bill, and if we file, maybe people will come. And so, we organized 200 people came out of the woodwork in the first week to collect signatures. Over 700 people ended up collecting signatures for that citizen initiative. The People's Veto, over 1,000 people collected signatures during that window. Thousands of people have volunteered on this effort in Maine. And when we started, we didn't do it because some big donor or funder said, I'll write you a check. We said, okay, I, Kyle Bailey, will do this, and we'll figure out a way to see if I can get paid at some point. I mean, that's literally the kind of campaign we ran, and we just took it to the people and said, do you want to do this? And so there was a real hunger on the part of Maine people, because they are frustrated with the constant self-imposed gridlock and partisanship and nothing getting done in Augusta or Washington, and Augusta looking more and more like Washington every day. And this can't be acceptable. Not only is it not acceptable for us, but this is really the system we want to leave for our kids and grandkids. Is this the thing? Is this okay? And so I think there's a real hunger and an appetite on the part of the people to say, we got to look for ways to change the system, to shift the power back to voters, right? Because it shouldn't be the party leaders and the special interests and the folks who can afford, the $5,000 plate meal that get their voices heard, while the rest of us, just sit back and watch it all play out, right? That's not a democracy. And so I think there's a real hunger on the part of the people to change that dynamic. We've seen it in Maine, and I'm getting calls from people all across the country who are saying, hey, how did you do that? I want to do that in Lansing, or I want to do that in Bozeman, or I want to do that in Oregon. And so people are going to be looking to Maine after we've done this, and I think it could be a catalyst.
Yep.
Because a lot of people don't know that this is an option. Right? Most of us go to work and work one or two jobs and are raising a family, and we are good citizens, so we show up and vote, and we try to pay attention a little bit what's going on. Maybe we'll watch a debate or two. But most Americans don't know that they have the choice to elect our politicians differently. And so part of this is, once you explain to someone that this is an option, what we saw in Maine was the voters we actually talked to one-on-one, the 150,000 conversations we had, 70% of the people we talked to said, I think that's a fantastic idea. Why the heck haven't we been doing that? Right? But
because it's just not part of what you've ever done.
It's not part of politics as usual, and politics as usual what people have known, because we've had a two-party system with Republicans and Democrats who can't at this point agree on much, except that they want to keep anybody else out of the system and protect the system the way it is.
Yeah.
And they've been at that game since the Whigs stopped being a political party in the 1850s.
Right.
So.
Well, it's been one of my arguments, and we mentioned it last week when our friend Nick Troiano was here. Duverger's law about the idea of when you in first past the post elections, it really will benefit or really force to the front a two-party system. A first past the post system will always benefit two parties, and it make it difficult. So no matter that we've had this explosive growth of independence, it won't matter, because the system will always default back to that first past the post, right versus left mentality. But this changes it. Duverger's is thrown out the door, because we no longer are forced into that mindset.
Right, and one of the hopes is that what we did in Maine was we were intentional about proposing an initiative that didn't get rid of Democratic Republican primaries. We keep those. We just apply ranked choice voting to them, because we knew that it's kind of a win-win for the parties, at least from the rank and file voters and local party leaders' perspective, and the independent third-party voters is. With ranked choice voting in the general election, if you're an independent or third-party candidate, the spoiler stuff goes away. I mean, you can stand there on the debate stage, raise your issues and concerns, not be told to get out of the race because you're splitting the vote and costing someone else the election, and contribute in a valuable way to the conversation that we're trying to have as a state or a country. And by using it in the party primaries, suddenly somebody didn't win the Republican or Democratic primary at 35% of the vote, right, who maybe is accountable to a particular faction. They've got to reach out more broadly. So to win the Republican primary, you got to figure out a way to get conservatives, liberals, and moderates to coalesce around your candidacy. And you have to be able to appeal more broadly. And so by using it in the party primaries, I think we help the two political parties put their best foot forward in the general election and offer voters a choice where more voters see themselves in that candidate than they would under the current system.
Now, are you getting any pushback, or are there any lawsuits filed that they're private companies and they should be able to have whatever kind of runoff system they want to have?
No, that's not the case in Maine.
I'm surprised that they will come up with 1,000 other legal arguments, right? So are there any in the party who see this as an opportunity? Because to me, I could make an argument that from a party boss that this would be a great opportunity for me to expand my market share.
Well, I think some people are starting to figure that out in the parties, that this is a good thing for their party, that they see the writing on the wall that millennials and the generation behind them, a majority of them are not members of a political party. They don't ever want to be a member of a political party. They're never going to organize themselves in that way. And so the model we have right now is not terribly sustainable. So if you want your party to survive, you really ought to think about how do you invite more people in. And so rather than trying to shrink the tent and say you have to pass the purity test to be here. And I think that this voting system is a way that puts pressure on the parties to go back to the drawing board and think about how do we build big tents that can reach out more broadly to voters and build a party that looks more like most voters in my state or area. You're not going to win everybody, but maybe trying to win with 35% of the vote and splitting the vote and calling some people spoilers and all that sort of stuff. We can't do that anymore, and so trying to use that same strategy under ranked choice voting is going to cost us votes. So we got to go back to the drawing board. I think that's what we hope to see happen in Maine.
So are there active opponents to this right now? Are they going to use this during the fall to take shots at the system to try to mess it up so it fails and we can go back to how it was?
I think that once voters actually use ranked choice voting, I think it's going to be increasingly hard to take it away from them. So when you look at places across the United States where voters have ranked choice voting, and you ask them, you had ranked choice voting, you used to have, first past the post, we call it, right? We're pick one plurality winner. What do you think about the two? Overwhelmingly, people say, well, I like the new thing better, right? Like, I don't ever feel like my vote is wasted. I don't have to choose between two people I don't really like. And campaigns are more civil, so what's not to like, right? And so once voters have the opportunity to engage in that sort of campaign and see it play out differently. Now, look, I'm not saying ranked choice voting is a silver bullet. I'm not saying negative campaign is going to go away, but it helps to reduce some of that rancor. I think once voters see that, they get a chance to do that, and they get a chance to walk in the voting booth and say, I really like this candidate. For the first time, I get a chance to vote for so-and-so because they really represent my values, and I'll rank a second choice knowing if my first choice can't win, my vote's not winning. That sort of, and the conversation that will play out, that ends up being less about the media driving the polls and more about substantive issues and contrast and similarities. I think voters are going to walk away from that election saying, boy, that's a lot better than anything else I've seen in a while. And I think it's going to be harder and harder to take that away from voters once they've had a chance to do it. And I think that's what opponents know.
Yeah.
It's why they fought so hard to stop us from having ranked choice voting at all, because they know once it's implemented, it's going to be hard to take it away because voters are going to see the benefits. And I recognize that there are some people who've been playing this game for decades, and they've been playing it a particular way where ranked choice voting is a threat to them.
Yeah.
Right? If you've been playing to a base for a long time, right, and you've been playing that game, suddenly you got to get to 50% plus one, this thing might look really scary to you. And maybe you've been playing your cards wrong for the last couple decades. And I get that, but we shouldn't have election systems based on protecting the powerful and the privileged career politicians who've been there for decades. We ought to have an election system that serves the best interest of the people.
So are you getting a lot of interest? Are people showing up and saying, how did you do it? Because I want to do it, and wherever they want to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I get phone calls all the time from people across the country who want to do this. There's definitely a growing interest in this. There's a group in Massachusetts that's trying to work to win ranked choice voting there. Statewide, I think they're going to try to win in a few cities first. You know, Utah is a pretty much a one-party state, Republican state. Ranked choice voting narrowly lost in the legislature there. And in a one-party state, a lot of times the party that's in charge says, you know, everybody's running in our party in the primary, and there's like 1 million people running for whatever office. Ranked choice voting is a really great way to find consensus within the party. Because, you know, when the party's not in consensus, even when it's a dominant political party, that, by the way, is when the small party, the minority party, gets a chance to kind of jump in there in that divide and win elections. So maybe we would benefit from having more consensus within our primaries.
And I know California is looking at a top 4 or top 5 with instant runoff as well as improvement on the top 2 that they've tried but didn't. I think it has shown some success, but they think it may be able to do even better.
Yeah, and you know, my advice to people is don't study, right? Talk to people in your community, talk to organizational leaders and voters and faith leaders and political leaders and civic leaders and business leaders and work with your League of Women Voters and your Common Cause and your, you know, whatever groups that there are in your community, build consensus and find out what's the best solution for you. I would never walk into a group and say, you got to do ranked choice voting, that's what's right for your community. I think every community needs to study for themselves. And by the way, that's how you build a movement. You don't build a movement by walking in somewhere and saying, you need to do this. You build a movement by saying, you all are stakeholders. What do you, is the status quo working for you? If not, what do you like, what do you not like? Let's explore some of the other options that are available to us and find out what's going to work best for us.
Now, Maine is interesting in that you've got a lot of independent candidates, and I know you and I are both affiliated with Unite America and like what it's doing, but you've got a bunch of independent candidates running there. Are they going to benefit from ranked choice this year or not?
No. Not in the governor's election, state senate election, and state house election in the November election. Those 3 elections are exempt from ranked choice voting. We had a Supreme Court case last year where the Maine Supreme Court said there's some language in Maine's Constitution from as it was amended in 1880 where the word plurality exists for those 3 races, and we don't think that the intent in 1880 was to allow ranked choice voting in those races. Well, okay. So we have conceded that point and said, look, we understand the Supreme Court's raised questions about using these 3 races. We've stripped those from the people's veto. We're restoring it for primary elections and federal races. And we'll probably have to come back and win a constitutional amendment in the future. But only the legislature can send that out. So once we get enough people elected with ranked choice voting in the legislature, they'll send out a constitutional amendment to be able to use it in these other races. So, but it's, you know, it's one step at a time to give voters the voice and the choice that they deserve.
Let me ask you this last question. You've been involved in campaigns and politics for a long time. We're here on a college campus. A lot of kids want to get involved in campaigns and politics. What do you look for when you're hiring young people?
Well, you know, this is something I'm really passionate about because I have run a couple campaigns now, and I go around to the college campuses and try to figure out who's graduating in May. You know, I'm looking for young people who are smart, who are passionate, who believe in the cause or what the candidate stands for, who are eager to learn, who don't think they have all the right answers, but are bringing their best ideas to the table, and are hungry, you know, to learn. And you know, I've been really lucky in my work in politics. When I was growing up, I wanted to be in politics, and I didn't know if there was were there jobs in politics? Like, do people get paid to like work on campaigns and stuff? I didn't know that. And I grew up in a small town in rural Georgia, and those resources and mentors weren't really available to me until I went to college and it started interning, volunteering, interning on campaigns. And I think getting an internship on a statewide U.S. Senate or governor's campaign is probably the best way to jump in and learn. I've hired several interns from past cycles to work on the current cycle and cycles before. I think that's probably the best way to get involved politics to me is something you learn by doing it and jumping in, you know, head first. And And if anybody wants to move to the beautiful state of Maine, we have a gorgeous rocky coast and mountains and lots of trees. And so if you're graduating in May, please send me your resume. If you meet those qualifications, we'd love to have you there.
Kyle, thank you for coming today. Really appreciate everything.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And we do have time for a couple of questions, if are any. Yes, sir, in the back.
Do you foresee any problems with the mechanics of voting or tabulating?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, you know, one of the things that I've learned doing the election reform work that I hadn't really thought much about before, and I was talking to one of the students here earlier, was how different every state is and how it conducts elections, literally. I mean, different vendors, some places different counties do it, some places towns do it. Some places, every town or county in the state has to use the same system. Some places, they're using 5 or 6 different systems. And so, you know, it really depends on where you are and what resources are available to you. And there are some systems in place that speed up the process of tabulating ranked choice ballots. Maine happens to have that. We have ES&S as our software, our company, the DS2000 tabulators, which Minneapolis uses in their ranked choice elections. They've actually already been used. And so it just needs a simple $25,000 software upgrade to scan the ranked choice ballots. But again, every place is different. But I'll also say Australia has been using ranked choice voting since 1917. And they haven't had any problems. And Ireland still does a hand count in their ranked choice presidential election, even though they have technology available to them. And so technology can help and speed up the process, but you don't need a computer to take a ranked ballot and make piles in front of you of everybody's first choice and then move the candidate with the smallest pile to the people's second choices and pile them up until somebody gets a majority.
I can see the other side, though, using that as wow, this is a great opportunity to monkey wrench with the counters on this, right?
Well, in Maine, we have the paper ballot. That still stays the same with ranked choice
So you
voting.
have a history.
And we have the tabulator, and the tabulator actually makes a digital scan of the ballots. So now we have a digital scan of the ballot, and we have the hard copy ballots. And what's really cool about ranked choice voting is we'll probably end up publishing the cast vote record, which is the Excel spreadsheet that shows line by line it's anonymous. It doesn't show who cast that ballot, but it says, you know, their rankings were, you know, A, C, D, B, A, B, C, D, whatever order it was for each row. That gets published, and you as a voter can go pull that spreadsheet on your computer and sort it yourself and see exactly how the person who won. And we haven't done that before in our state.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Other questions? Yes, sir.
So I'm just curious, what's next for you? Can you see past the rank voting projects that you have ahead, or is it all just rank voting?
Well,
What's next for you?
I'm spending most of my time right now, this next couple months, working on the people's veto in Maine. There will obviously need to be ongoing work in Maine to defend ranked choice voting, and we know that there's an ongoing conversation at some point about needing to pass a constitutional amendment to use ranked choice voting in all races. So that's an ongoing work there. You know, it's interesting watching the places across the country that want to do this, and how can I be a resource to them, and so those are part of the conversations. I'll also say I'm managing a statewide governor's election in Maine right now too. That's on the November election ballot, so that's my immediate future beyond ranked choice voting in June. Terry Hayes is state treasurer. She's running for governor. I'm managing her campaign. You know, I'd love it to, we were talking about this beforehand, how the kind of reform space and the independent space fit nicely together in terms of the work, because I think that, you know, independent third-party candidates obviously benefit from political reforms that open up the process.
Yep.
And at the same time, independent candidates, at the same time, it's a mutually beneficial relationship. So it's interesting to be able to work back and forth between in that space.
How will people who are elected in this system, how does that change the way that they'll approach their job in the legislature? I mean, will they be better legislators because of the way they got elected?
Well, you know, it's interesting. So ranked choice voting is going to be used in the primaries in June. It's only one legislative race that's going to use ranked choice. It's a three-way Republican House race.
Right. I'm speaking theoretically.
Theoretically, right. I think theoretically, yeah, it starts to, even in that race, so I'll say, the newspapers have asked those 3 candidates who are running for state house outside of Lewiston, Maine, about ranked choice voting. None of them are supportive of it, but it's interesting to watch their comments, and not just like, that's awful, don't rank. No one's saying don't rank, right? They're saying, oh, I don't like that, we don't need that. But no one's saying don't rank. And so the fact that it's there is starting to change some of the conversation. What's unfortunate, I think, about a lot of issues is a lot of good ideas that are nonpartisan enter a state legislature, and suddenly one party or the other decides this is about one party or the other, and then the polarization kicks in. And so unfortunately in the Maine legislature, Democrats have been pretty much supportive of ranked choice voting. Majority of Democrats have been supportive, majority of Republicans have been opposed. And so that's been an unfortunate divide in our legislature. By the way, it's different in every state, right? It's who's in power that seems to have problems with it. Sorry, I lost track of your question.
How will they serve once they're elected under the
Yeah,
system?
so
How will it change their way?
I think that you'll start to see people thinking differently about how they engage in the campaigns, and then once they get there, they didn't win. It's when you win with 35% of the vote, there's part of you that says, well, you can just keep dipping into that well, right? All you have to ever do is please that 35%, and as long as they love you, to hell with everybody else. And so you can't really do that with ranked choice voting. And if you do, you're probably not going to win re-election. And so I think it's a fundamental change, and it starts on the campaign by campaigning differently and building coalitions and being more collaborative on the campaign trail. And I think that naturally extends itself into the governing process, because that's so absent in our politics right now.
Yep.
That if candidates start to win because they didn't just go knock on the doors of voters who agree with them 100%. They had to go knock on voters' doors who will agree with them in 90%, or 80%, or 70%, and ask for second choice rankings. And suddenly, they had interactions with people who they're accountable to who don't agree with them on every issue. And so they have to factor in those people's support and votes in the next election, and that affects their behavior in the legislature. And I think that's a powerful piece.
I think it's incredible. I think it's incredibly powerful. Yes, ma'am.
So what do you anticipate that this will do with interest groups and their marketing of their candidates?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I can give examples across the country where, for example, mayors have won under ranked choice voting who built grassroots campaigns who were not backed by the most money in the special interests. Former mayor of Minneapolis, Betsy Hodges, won in ranked choice voting. She built a grassroots coalition, and she was outspent 3-1. So I think that because ranked choice voting eliminates the spoiler effect and the vote splitting and reduces the rancor in campaigns, I mean, how much of special interest money is spent on trash and burn TV ads, right? Most of it. It's not spent on knocking on doors, having positive conversations with voters, for the most part. I mean, some groups do, but not for the most part. So when you remove that factor, maybe it makes those special interest groups actually go knock on voters' doors and talk. But those special interest groups are now not just saying vote for this person because everybody else is evil. They're actually saying, well, make this person your first choice. And that voter says, well okay,
Right.
I appreciate that. You guys did you guys choose a second choice? Did you guys endorse a second choice candidate? Did you endorse a slate saying that you make this person your first choice, second choice, third? So it fundamentally alters the way those conversations play out. And I think by doing that, both from a money perspective and from a, taking the power away from small ideological factions where a lot of the special interests are rooted, it lessens the power of special interest and puts the power back in your hands. Right? That's the shift that happens with ranked choice voting, where your voice matters more because you actually feel like your voice is heard. And there's no wasted votes. There's no spoiler effect. There's no conversation about who raised that'll always be there, but it's not all about who raised the most money, and there's two choices, and right, it's suddenly money's a factor. But if you get in the debate stage and voters like what you have to say, and maybe you're being outspent 3-1, but there's 10 debates, maybe you got a shot, and maybe there's a chance for you to run and win because voters will be able to see you as an option and not a wasted vote. And I think that changes that dynamic.
Yes, sir.
it seems like your system is sensible, but not necessarily unless the state has a significant percent of independents or other party candidates. I'm thinking, for example, of Kansas, and we don't at this point. So how can we address that? Because it sounds like it's going to come back to the binary choice again.
Yeah.
And it may result, it may result in having a more representative candidate from each party, which was certainly a benefit. But can it go further than that?
Well, that's a really great question, and that in part goes back to my earlier comment about figuring out what's the right fit for your state or community in terms of which reform is right. But I will say, I think even in Kansas, that I think your registration is disproportionately Republican. Or a state like Utah, which is pretty much Republican. And so they've looked at ranked choice voting as being helpful in that primary, that's where a lot of the competition is. So that may be, in some places, the entry point for ranked choice voting may be using it in the primary. And when voters are familiar with it and candidates are familiar with it, it might be that having that system in place and extending to the general election might result in more candidates deciding to run in the general election. So, in a state like Utah, if you use it in the general election, maybe you'd have some more libertarian candidates run. Maybe you'd get different, the Constitution Party or whatever, or independents run. So it creates that space. Look, there's no denying that the two political parties have a lot of built-in advantages, regardless of what voting system you may have, right? There's party allegiance and databases and voter files and money and most of us have the party registration of our parents, right? So all that stuff is kind of inherent, but this does change the calculus, so it's less about, as we were talking earlier, about preserving the political power of two political parties and actually saying, what do you want? You're the voter. Why don't you get to decide? And I think that's the shift.
Saw one more. Oh, sorry, you were, we'll come back to you.
So just a question on the logistics of how it works between the primary and the general election. So if you've got primaries in the Democrat and Republican parties, but no primary for independents, you could conceivably have 7 candidates on the general election ballot, of which you've now only allotted 2 slots to the 2 major parties. And how does the dynamic, how do you see the dynamic playing out in Maine?
Well, that's what happens now in Maine.
Okay.
So Maine, we typically have more than one independent candidate on a general election ballot. They have to get twice as many signatures as a party candidate, and then they advance right to the November ballot. So there's no party primary because they're not a part of a political party, they're unenrolled. So they're essentially running to put their name on the November ballot. So ranked choice voting simply, if used in a November election, would give voters more voice and more choice with those existing candidates, which is the challenge we're trying to fix in Maine with ranked choice voting.
But it's possible you could have, it could get out of hand with the number of independents or third-party people who qualify for the fall ballot.
Well, I think most places have, some places have more rigorous than other signature or monetary requirements to gain ballot access. So typically in Maine, Maine has a pretty small D-democracy in terms of accessibility. And the most candidates we've ever had run for governor and get, to run as an independent for governor in Maine, you need 4,000 signatures, and you have 6 months to get them. So that's, if you're really committed, even just as a candidate, you can probably go out and get those signatures yourself, right? So and yet we've only had, I think, a max of 6 people ever run for governor. A Democrat, Republican, and then 4 non-party people. So that I don't think that we're going to see a million people decide to run for office. I don't think that's that's neither the goal from my view or the likely outcome. But what is likely is in places where there's a hunger for voters to have a third choice, or maybe a third or fourth choice, you will see that hunger addressed with ranked choice voting in place, because suddenly, that green or that libertarian or that independent can participate in the election and not be a spoiler or a wasted vote, And those dynamics go away. So I wouldn't be surprised if you saw, if Kansas, let's say, adopted ranked choice voting statewide, you get a Democrat, Republican, Independent, maybe a Libertarian and a Green. You know, that would, with whatever ballot requirements that you have, that they've met those and then move on to that election.
We had one last one right here.
First of all, thanks for the invite to Maine.
Uh-huh.
However, I'll have to think about that because we have a son and daughter-in-law who like to camp up there and come home with welts of mosquito bites. But my question is more about just logistics. What does the ballot look like? I mean, how does the computer read? What little dots do I color
Yeah.
in? You know, how does it, as far as ranking?
Yeah, I should have brought an example. So, you know, when you walk in the voting booth now and there's 3 candidates running, there's 3 ovals, right? An oval next to each of their names. Think about adding 2 more columns. So there's now 3 ovals next to someone's name. And at the top it says first choice, second choice, and third choice. So, you know, you like this candidate the best, you find the first choice column, you go down, fill in the bubble next to that candidate. Your second choice, you go to the second choice column, drop down, fill in the oval next to their name within the second choice column. The third choice column, find your third choice candidate, fill in the bubble next to their name. Well, in Maine, you certainly can. Under our ranked choice law, you can rank as many or as few candidates as you like. If you just want to bullet vote, because you only like that candidate and to heck with everybody else, you can do that. Yes, there is in Maine.
Great questions today.
Yeah.
Thank you all. Thank you, Kyle, for being here today. This is great conversation.
My pleasure. Thank you all. Thank you.
And thank you all for coming. We don't have a discussion next week, but in 2 weeks, Jackie Salet from Independent Voting will be here from New York City, who's been in the business for as long as anybody. So it'll be a very a great guest to end our discussion group for the spring. Thanks for coming.